competition based on price and quality is the dominant force of capitalism. It always has been, right? And it always will be. But then on top of that triangle, there is this element of social response capitalism. So in other words, 20th century capitalism had very much to do with the cost of capital. How do you borrow to grow and then compete on price and quality? 21st century capitalism, it's a subtle but important point, is now very much more about the social value of capital.
With us this month is Bruce Piasecki, the president and founder of the AHC Group, as well as the author of the recently published Doing More with Less. Thanks for joining us, Bruce.
My pleasure, Becky.
Well, that's an interesting book title, Bruce, since our viewers as corporate financial executives are under increased pressure to cut costs these days. It seems as if every business wants their workers to do more with less, don't they?
After 30 years, the way I think about it is that financial executives really do three things. They manage money, they manage people, and they manage rules. So for example, the external world is always giving them the new FASB standard or the new rules. In terms of people, it's the comptroller, it's the financial planners, it's the technical guys, and in terms of money, it's the relationship of the cost of capital and creditworthiness. Doing more with less is success because it enables you a new approach to money, people, and rules.
Let me follow up, Bruce, and ask you, what's driving this move to do more with less? Is it based on profitability, or in some cases, is it just a matter of plain old frugality?
It boils down in today's world of controlling the positioning of your near future. And so the firms that are being respected in automaking, such as Toyota, the investment community understands them as having positioned for the future. They have the hybrid powertrain, they have lean manufacture, they understand a world a little bit better of 7 billion souls. So that for me, doing more with less is about positioning the value of the firm towards the near future, and the arts of competitive frugality are the arts executives need to refine in order to position for the future, as opposed to just being completely reactive. So the way I visualize it is that financial managers are the people in a very large corporate mansion. But what increasingly matters today is how they're doing in the neighborhood. What information are they disclosing? What are the corporate disclosure trends? Who are they letting peek into the mansion? What stakeholders are they inviting up the stairwell of the mansion? All of these things can be done more efficiently and more productively with this mantra of doing more with less.
Well, it's not human nature to want to do more work. And you know our viewers, they already feel overwhelmed in recent years by increased demands along with reduced resources. What's the case for going that extra mile?
Well, I think Becky, if the question is about how the executive receives the respect to do extra performance, let me say it to you this way. Essentially, if your job is to better align and balance money, people, and rules, you come to discover that there's a couple of tools you have in order to do more with less. The first is the classical one of rewarding people through incentive and also having the ability through disincentive to eliminate the knucklehead. But you deal with people with vision and passion and the music you play while administering those financial incentives and disincentives. So I've come to believe that the greatest teams and the greatest performers are not only doing it for money, they're doing it out of pride, they're doing it out of brand, and they're doing it out of joy and satisfaction. And what I have found the most compelling feature of competing on frugality is that the people stick with you in a loyal way because they know you're strong and steady, just like a competitive basketball team or a competitive football team. If you manage too tightly and have a rule-dominated firm, people are going to be in the absence of freedom. If you manage too freely, you're going to have a bunch of knuckleheads. And so my work is very much about finding that productive balance as a management consultant and in operating my own firm over these last 30 years. And it got me thinking about how much waste there is in the modern corporation due to knuckleheads. The comptroller, the corporate planning officers, the CFO, the senior management team actually have a new obligation in the post-world of Sarbanes-Oxley to document the elimination of that type of waste. The people in the system who are wasting their time, the people in the system who are wasting their resources, banging their head against a clear glass that will in no way influence the game of the firm.
I know it's the title of your latest book, Bruce, and I like that concept of competitive frugality. But tell me, what does that mean in this context?
Let me give you a couple examples, Becky. And Pat Mahoney in the chapter Scarcity and Creativity is, to me, an extremely creative financial manager for several classical reasons. So he builds a $1.2 billion Fairfield renewable energy facility. Classical financial frugality. He gets Obama stimulus money for this plant. He gets the governor of Maryland to say, at the right time politically, I'm proud that we're doing this innovation. He moves processed waste from the eastern seaboard, brings it to Baltimore Harbor, and from a different client of ours, leases for 100 years contaminated soil for 5 cents to the dollar, and uses another corporate affiliate of my firm, Arcadis, to clean it up within superior limits so that the governor and the mayor and the EPA likes the guy. So he's taking a damaged asset, he's bringing new life to it, he's providing energy out of waste, and to me it's an embodiment of the opposite of a knucklehead. It's a very Ben Franklin-like approach to modern competition because he's frugal, he's inventive, and he's also diplomatic with stakeholders. So much for industry, my friends, and attention to one's own business. But to these we must add frugality if we would make our industry more certainly successful. These are the words of Ben Franklin, spoken more than 300 years ago in his classic essay, The Way to Wealth. The essay that formed the fundamental inspiration to my 8th book, Doing More with Less. What is this book about? Well, it's about exploring the vital link between our childlike instinct for competitiveness with our adult obligations to address the scarcity of modern needs. In many ways, Franklin was my inspiration because he helped me rethink the vital link between competition and frugality, which are in the end the things that determine our freedoms, our fate, and our fortune.
Hello and welcome to the first edition of Capital Land Quarterly in 2008. I'm Lydia Colbita from News Channel 13.
And I'm Rex Smith from the Times-Union. Thanks for joining us once again. You know, at Capital Land Quarterly, we look to highlight individuals who are constantly forward-thinking. We did that in our last installment with RPI President Shirley Ann Jackson, who has led a renaissance at the Troy Research Institute. Today, we highlight Dr. Bruce Piasecki.
Dr. Piasecki is an author and consultant from Ballston Spa. He's a sought-after energy and environmental consultant to big companies like Toyota, Chevron, and DuPont. In his latest book, World Inc., he outlines the new frontier in business, the S frontier, and how moving toward a social response capitalism can improve a company's bottom line and the environment.
At our recent Capital Land Quarterly breakfast, Bruce Piasecki talked about how all this could affect life in the capital region.
Competition based on price and quality is the dominant force of capitalism. It always has been, right? And it always will be. But then on top of that triangle, there is this element of social response capitalism. So in other words, 20th century capitalism had very much to do with the cost of capital. How do you borrow to grow and then compete on price and quality? 21st century capitalism, it's a subtle but important point, is now very much more about the social value of capital. So how does this influence our area? And how does it influence what the arguments in World Inc.? Two quick points to make. Why are these multinationals even beginning to get up on this S? Well, they really do it only for 5 reasons, all of which are legitimate, selfish, but increasingly social reasons of corporations. The first reason they do it is for global access, right? You cannot operate in Europe or Asia without this worldview. So that's the first reason to do it. The second reason they do it is for margin improvement. In the case of the Toyota hybrid powertrain, Toyota is actually more profitable by pursuing efficiency than GM is pursuing its multiple brands, right? The third reason they do it is product differentiation. In this realm of very rapid information, people are always wanting to be hip for the new and the different, and that's why these firms are doing it. So let me try and sum up what I think the capital district will look like in this global equity market. And I use the phrase in the book from Mark Smith's Wall Street study called Global Equity Culture. It's a wonderful book. I think within 3 to 5 Christmases from now, Capital Land will find utilities that will charge an escalating price for owners that have energy-intensive homes. If you just look at the trends across all states on LEED certification, on Energy Star, on the purchase trends of renewable power in homes, and on greenhouse gas inventories, I really think that this is inevitable. And I'd like you to know that National Grid has awarded my firm recently with Syracuse State University and the Environmental Science and Forestry. We're going to bring 800 leaders to Central New York in July on the rising role of renewables in Central New York. I think it's no longer a fad. I think it's an inevitability. Some of the other changes that I see that will be happening within 3 to 5 Christmases is that the owners of SUVs and larger vehicles may face a luxury tax, just like we face when we buy a Lamborghini or we buy a sports car. I see that rumbling happening because of this new frontier. I also think that the great dairy farmers of New York State in Capital Land are going to be very rapidly forced to use biomass and methane as part of their operation. I think the ag subsidies will probably be restructured in reference to that. And I do believe that overall, if you think about how tobacco got taxed 15 years ago, in an age of Al Gore and climate change, I think it's sensible to now predict that within the next 8 years, it took me 8 years to write World Inc., but within the next 8 years, there will be some sort of petrochemical tax, because the treadmill on the petrochemical infrastructure is reaching a point where it might not be a carbon tax, it might be more indirect, but it's still going to be significant.
When we come back, we'll talk at more length with Dr. Piasecki in our Roundtable segment. Welcome back to Capital Land Quarterly. I'm here at the Roundtable now with Bruce Piasecki for a little bit more conversation about the topics that he addressed in his speech to the Capital Land Quarterly audience. Bruce, I was intrigued by one of the things that you said about leadership in your book, and let me just quote from it. You said, climate change is of such a magnitude and complexity that it requires a new form of leader, a leader capable of talking about both what's good for their firm and what's needed for society. And I'm intrigued by how corporations respond to this. You have corporate boards that I think are accustomed to looking for leaders who will maximize profits, but you're looking at corporations that are looking for leaders, you believe, that have a voice beyond that?
Well, thank you for referring to that part of leadership in the book, Rex. When Publishers Weekly reviewed the book, I'm happy to say that it was a book on business and society, and then they kindly said, and you get a third one on leadership. So I believe that last century, the people who understood how to frame social needs were often political leaders. You know, the great Winston Churchill speeches about restraint, or Abe Lincoln the century before about the needs to keep a divided nation together. Often today, a multinational corporation is put in a similar position of healing divided loyalties, like Lincoln, or dealing with restraint in a time of cutbacks. And so I believe that in my chapter called Developing Leaders We Can Trust, I isolate the 10 mottos that struck me as sensible after looking at this multinational behavior about how you find a new leader. And the key is what Toogood said in his book called The Articulate Executive. When you are a leader, you are not just reporting the profit margin, the debt to equity, the numbers. You are carrying the entire mansion of the corporation everywhere you go. And as the rating agencies that judge your creditworthiness and judge the value of your capital can see that mansion even if the speaker doesn't necessarily see it. And so I think we live in a new century of more corporate transparency. Sarbanes-Oxley's Section 404 is just the tip of that iceberg towards more corporate transparency. So in the World Inc. century, I believe we need to have leaders that are more socially attuned, that have what Goodman calls social intelligence as well as market intelligence.
In about an hour's time, the US Labor Department is expected to announce that more than 200,000 people found jobs last month, and that would point to the best 4 months of new employment in 6 years, even if unemployment remains unchanged at 8.6%. Well, the key for President Obama is whether this improvement is sustainable, indeed whether the jobs themselves are built to last. As the presidential election looms, are Americans adjusting to the major economic shocks of recent years? Well, joining me now from our New York studio is Bruce Piasecki, a specialist in sustainability issues, also author of a book on wealth called Doing More with Less. Bruce Piasecki, thanks very much for joining us. You talk about the United States being a land of diminished expectation these days. Do you think Americans are coming to terms with their new position?
David, it's a great question, and I believe we have a kind of self-awareness now and a self-consciousness about how much resources in the world we use, while at the same time we also have an awareness of how much wealth creation comes from those numbers.
Well, I just wonder how you square that then with the, I understand there's more oil being pumped out of the US than for many years out of the ground there. President Obama saying we're drilling all over the place right now, and that's still very much the old-fashioned sort of gas-guzzling American message ahead of an election, isn't it?
Well, I think that there are at least 60 million of the many 300+ million Americans that have developed this doing more with less is success mantra. I also think that those that are from the more dominant or emerging culture are fighting a fight that will change quite rapidly. And so we are coming back to a kind of American pragmatism where the virtues of frugality, like in a Ben Franklin sense, not cheapness, but frugality, competitive frugality, inventiveness in a Ben Franklin way of thinking about public libraries and lightning, and also diplomacy instead of warlike. And I now believe that 1 out of 5 Americans have this view.
At the expense of the consumerist image, which is something which obviously, certainly for the last century, Americans have grown up with and come to expect.
Well, I do think that what's so fascinating, David, about the American way is that it's a semi-osmotic membrane, and many of the people that I get to work with in the multinationals I advise understand that this membrane called America is going both ways. It's a globalized economy. And as you can see in the work of other people who think about globalization, the key thing to worry about is how do you change products, lifestyle, and government policy so that you realign money, people, and rules to allow this liberation of frugality.
Right. Who is driving that then? Because many people would suggest that it's certainly not the politicians.
I think the politicians have been lost in a kind of ideological wheel spinning of extremes. I do think there's a permanent face to government which has set up some executive orders of frugality and executive orders of doing more with less that are part of the bureaucratic culture. I think there are 3 drivers, and the most exciting one is the spirit of the people, these LOHAS, 60 million plus, who have a lifestyle and an intellect and a global perspective of being world citizens. I actually now believe, David, that the supercharged superhero of this new book of mine, Ben Franklin, is more a world citizen, although most of the world still thinks of him as an American. The number of British clubs he has, the way that he looked at the world. And I think there are many, many, many more Ben Franklins in the world, and we're beginning to discover.
Okay, you see lessons clearly that we can learn for the future to be taken from the past. Bruce Piasecki, author and expert on sustainability issues.
Bruce Piasecki, how is doing more with less a new way to wealth? Because it sounds like a paradox.
Doing more with less is success in a world of 7 billion souls, because it allows you to have a better umbrella of protection on risk, it allows you to benefit from compounded interest, and it allows you to outlast the competition.
Can you give me an example, maybe of a public company or a well-known company that's adapted the principles that you write about in the book and has really done well?
At least 5. Toyota, when they pursued the hybrid powertrain, they increased global market share. Over the last few years, I've worked for a Warren Buffett firm called Shaw Industries, which improved their stock value as they brought recycled content into carpeting and hardwood flooring. My own firm, which is now 31 years old and works for more than 50 multinationals each year, is incredibly frugal in a competitive sense, in the sense that we haven't had debt for 10 years, and everybody in my firm, a former executive, is doing quite well financially.
And how did you change the way that people thought in these firms to think, instead of, wow, we really have no resources, we're in big trouble, and change that way of thinking into, wow, we can be innovative now because we have less?
Greg, it is a wow. You know, the mantra doing more with less as a new way to wealth goes way back to someone like Ben Franklin, who had an early sense that one needed to be inventive in times of scarcity. One had to be diplomatic instead of warlike. And so if you look at the pattern of some of the companies that are really teaching people how to save money and teaching people how to compound interest, I believe that's a wave of the near future.
Well, we've seen companies like Groupon come out and what they're offering is a way to save money, an ROI for the consumer. Do you think over the next few years we're going to see more IPOs like that, even though they're having a little bit of trouble right now with their accounting?
Well, I think that even the internet revolution, the Googles and the Intels, are firms that essentially have taught the world that the era of 20th century capitalism based on superabundance is outdated. These are firms that are all about the swift and severe and frugal dynamics of the new world market. So it's the new IPOs, but it's also the classic information economy type firms that I write about. Now, what I'm bringing it to in my management practice is the manufacturing giants. And if you go to ahcgroup.com, you'll see lots of corporate affiliates that are taking the principles of this book.
Finally, speaking of historical changes and manufacturing, is one of the reasons that Americans are going to have to do more with less in the future because China and India want to have more? Is it a zero-sum game? Do we have to have less if they're going to rise?
Well, if you think of the firms that are rapidly growing in their economy now, China, India, Brazil, these are firms that my multinational firms do a lot of work in those countries. Here's some of the numbers. In America, we consume about 25% of the world's resources, and thank God, we contribute about 33% of the world's wealth. So there's a kind of efficient transfer of wealth creation. In some of these countries, like Brazil, the numbers are even better. They're consuming less of the world's resources, ironically, in the net, but creating more wealth through innovation. So the way of the future is to change that ratio and to decouple the idea that you need a superabundance of resources. The other thing that's very much the theme of my book, Greg, is doing more with less is very relevant to time. As one uses time more efficiently, you're more competitive, you're more frugal, you're more effective.
Back to Ben Franklin.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Greg.